So, the Tau Empire's kinda not been focused on at all recently in Warhammer's fluff. The last time we checked in on them was in Arcs of Omen, and that boiled down to their rebellious character Farsight being told to fuck off and die by Tau leadership, which, in of itself, doesn't give anyone a good picture of them, or why the hell Farsight would even bother to call them and offer a deal. This makes talking about the Tau as a faction pretty difficult. It also doesn't help that the Tau are tucked away deep in the southeastern fringe of the galaxy, isolating them from a lot of the major events and kinda just doing their own thing. To put this into perspective, the last event to actually affect them as a whole was 8th edition's Psychic Awakening, and that was just them being confused about Psychers and getting stuck in a war of attrition with the Imperial Guard and Gene Stealer cults. With that said, due to a poll I ran on Patreon, it was decided that it was about time for me to cover the major event that officially introduced the Tau into the fluff, and was the Imperium's first official encounter turned war with the Tau Empire, and is the reason why the Tau tend to be cautious with the Imperium when treading close to their borders. It's time to talk about the Damocles Gulf Crusade. Now, the problem is that there were technically two of these events, as the Damocles Gulf was the center of both the Tau's second and third attempts at expanding their borders. But since they are separated by about 200 years, and the third sphere expansion is more of the character Shadow Sun story, we're only going to cover the first event. Plus, if I could avoid talking about the shit show that was the third sphere expansion and the book Damocles, anything is a good excuse. Because, hot damn, does that book hurt me mentally! Either way, let's see how the second sphere expansion, and by extension, the Damocles Gulf Crusade, played out. So, let's start with the backstory. The Tau Empire, as I said earlier, is in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, and as any empire eventually wishes to do, they wanted to expand their border and influence. So, the Tau's ruling caste, called the Ethereal Caste, declared the first sphere expansion in M37502, which was a massive military and political campaign by the Tau to bring new species and worlds into their empire, and spread their belief system of the greater good. A belief that the individual matters less than the progress of the collective whole, and that all should strive to make life better for the whole group. With that mindset, the Tau are an oddity in 40k, as they are the ones who will stick their hand out in friendship and cooperation first, and only jump to military action when they're threatened or deem the planet strategically necessary to fight a greater threat. Though, even when engaging in fighting, unless it's an extreme situation, they will always go to the negotiating table if they can, leading to their first expansion being a massive success, with the only race they encountered not wanting to join being the Orcs, because the Orcs find the Tau's way of life boring, as is the Orc way of life, fighting everything and everyone. Now, the first expansion group did run into the Imperium, but they ran to the far-out colonies of the Imperium, worlds that the Imperium barely remembered were there, and only asked for tithes every decade or century or so, if they even remembered to do that. Meaning that when the Tau came to these worlds, they weren't immediately shot at for being aliens, and some would even form open trade agreements with them because what's the harm in trading some crops for better weapons and farming equipment? It isn't a bad idea for a colony world. The Tau, of course, learned about the Imperium through these colonies, but with how the colonists spoke about them, it sounded like a distant, dying empire. So why the hell would they even need to worry about it? And with the Tau eventually bringing those colonies into the Empire as a whole, with no response from the Imperium, it was a reasonable assumption by the Tau that they could add a few more worlds from the Imperium into their growing empire. However, it was during the second sphere expansion where the Tau finally heard the cocking of the Imperium's metaphorical shotgun. You see, during the second sphere expansion, the Tau had progressed deeper into Imperial territory, and when the Inquisition got wind that Imperial worlds in the Eastern Fringe were openly trading and consorting with aliens, they launched an investigation, and what they found was the most horrible things ever. Humans trading resources with aliens! And this crime could not stand, as humanity would never work with aliens! So, with the Inquisition's mostly biased reports, the Imperial war machine got itself gathered up, assigning Imperial Admiral Jalak as the fleet leader and General Wendell Gage to coordinate and lead the Imperial Guard forces on the ground. These two would be leading 19 regiments of Imperial Guard and coordinating with 10 varying chapters of Space Marines, which included the Ultramarines, Iron Hands, and White Scars, along with dozen capital ships and their respective fleet elements, along with a Titan Brigade. Not a bad haul for a crusade. The crusade began at the worlds of Garrus and Kleist, as those two worlds were in open rebellion, and when a rebel world is faced down with this sheer amount of firepower, yeah, they got steamrolled real quick. After establishing new Imperial authorities over those worlds, the crusade moved on to engage the Tau for the first time in a nearby system called Hydas. Really, GW? Now, the Tau knew the Imperium was coming. Two worlds that they were trying to bring into the fold had just gone completely quiet. However, the Imperial response they got wasn't what they were expecting. The Tau fleets did have the advantage with range and firepower of their torpedoes, however the Imperial fleet just closed the gap, getting into broadside range and tearing into the Tau ships, with boarding parties of Space Marines showing how helpless the Tau soldiers were when it came to boarding actions. Then came the planetary assaults, where the Tau's orbital defenses in the Hydas system were no threat to the fleet at all. Able to land their units on the planet of Psi-Il-Kel, the Imperium learned the Tau's ground units weren't anything to sneeze at, with Tau infantry holding clearly better weapons and armor than the Guard was fielding, and their grav tanks, like the Hammerhead gunship, not only keeping pace with the famous Lehman Russ tanks, but also proving to actually be a far superior tank. The only reason the Imperium won the Battle of Psi-Il-Kel was because of the size of the Emperor Space Marine chapter stepping in to save the Imperial Guard units and preventing a massacre. With that showing, the Crusade fleet decided to cross into the Damocles Gulf proper, as aside from the brutal fighting of Psi-Il-Kel, the fighting had been actually pretty easy up to this point. Yeah, the Tau ground game was tough, but nothing Space Marines couldn't handle, and so long as the Guard held strategic objectives and the Space Marines did what Space Marines do best, this extermination campaign would be a breeze! Foreshadowing is a literary Once the Crusade made the 5-month push, they arrived at the Tau world of Dal'yth, and here, the Imperium learned just how out of their depth they were. The Tau fleet around Dal'yth was far superior to the fleets they encountered before, and this time, the Tau fleet was properly supported by the planet's orbital defenses. Even though the Imperium still won the orbital battle, the Tau would cost the Imperium 4 capital ships and 14 escort ships. A horrific loss. And remember, this is just the front door of the Tau Empire. With a healthy new respect and understanding of the Tau's firepower and strategies, the Imperium became more cautious in their approach to the invasion, launching their ground invasion after systematically destroying the orbital platforms left over from the fleet battle. With the Imperium securing its landing zones and a growing appreciation for Tau roadwork, the Imperium's forces ran into an immediate wall of the Tau's defensive strategy: hit and run warfare. Even with Titan's support, the Imperial spearhead was shattered into 3 groups. All 3 groups also began to run into worsening problems, as the Tau revealed their advanced cloaking technology and started harassing Imperial forces with hit-and-run strikes. Tau missile artillery took out Imperial armored units, and even worse, the one advantage the Imperials thought they had with Space Marines was thrown out the window when the Tau brought out their advanced battlesuits, which the Imperials hilariously thought were flying dreadnoughts. Even worse for the Imperials, the Tau were sending reinforcements to Dal'yth, and the siege was grinding on. The only thing keeping the Crusade in the fight was Space Marine patrols responding to Tau ambushes. However, General Gage saw the writing on the wall. If the Imperium wanted the Crusade to succeed, they would need far more than what they had. And to add insult to injury, the Tau had taken plenty of prisoners, one of them being a Space Marine chapter master, and the 8th Company captain of the Ultramarines was killed. Gage decided this situation was foobar and began to prioritize a retreat from Dal'yth. Gage reorganized the Imperial forces to push the Tau back and hold them at the continent's seaboard, while the other forces sabotaged the Tau airfields and secured a major starport so Gage could evacuate his forces safely. Though, once the other Imperial commanders and Space Marine leaders learned what he was planning, they began to protest and argue against the evacuation. Gage, however, held firm that the situation wasn't salvageable, and he got the perfect excuse, as the First Tyrannic War was just starting, and Inquisitor Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos was demanding that all forces in the Eastern Fringe redeploy to counter the invading High Fleet behemoth. If you want to know how that played out, check out my Need to Know Tyrannic Wars video. Now, the Tau, who were in a complete panic from the Imperial invasion of Dal'yth and getting their shit pushed in for 5 months, were desperate to end the fighting. Though they tried a few times to engage in diplomatic talks with the Crusade forces, the Crusade's command structure usually told them to fuck off. But with the new orders from the Inquisition, Gage and some of the Crusade's command structure did begin diplomatic talks, which ended with the Imperium being able to leave the Damocles Gulf unmolested. The Damocles Gulf Crusade ended in a bitter draw. The Imperium clearly didn't learn from the failures of the Damocles Gulf, but the Tau, on the other hand, had an existential crisis of faith. The Tau hadn't faced resistance this intense at all, and even worse, they learned this wasn't even a fraction of what the Imperium could throw at them. Not to mention that the Tau had captured plenty of Imperial war gear and technology, and when their prisoners would bother to answer their questions, the only answer they had was, I don't know, I just chant at it and it works. Which, when you're trying to understand your enemy, that's not a comforting answer to hear from their own specialists. However, this campaign did teach the Tau how they should engage with the Imperium from here on out. The Tau learned that the Imperium is a sleeping beast. So long as you don't poke the bear, it won't eat you. The Tau don't know, though, that the Imperium is a floundering empire, and couldn't steamroll them without taking massive losses. They chose to focus on the outlying colonies that the Imperium had forgotten about, and if they did accidentally run into an important Imperial world, the extent of communication was either, oops, sorry, didn't see the border, and immediately leave, or try to engage in good faith trade diplomacy. Factions within the Inquisition were fine with these Outer Worlds trading, as it allowed them to study the Tau's technology and just how advanced the Tau are. The Damocles Gulf event was the founding story of the Tau in Warhammer, and is the official first contact between Imperium and Tau. The event does boil down to a draw, but it definitively shows how scary the Imperium is when aggravated, and establishes the character and tactics of the Tau, giving both sides a great showing as factions, so that players of both factions would be happy with the outcome. Although, this would only be the start of the annoying Tau hate. Guys, if you can't figure out how to stop a ranged army from shooting you, the problem isn't the army, it's you. And that concludes the first Damocles Gulf War. There is a sequel with Commander Shadowsun, but we will cover that at a later date. Next time, we'll be covering the Drop Site Massacre, the event that would brutally traumatize the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders chapters, and have lasting consequences all the way into modern 40k for those chapters. Then after that, since it came next in the poll, we will cover the Bad Dab War, which is my favorite story within Warhammer 40k. But until then, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow the Twitch to come hang out with me and my community while I stream, and join the Patreon. For only $5 Canadian a month, you can see my exclusive Battletech series and see videos earlier than they appear on YouTube. Though if you can't do that, don't stress about it. Your viewership and sharing my content is more than enough. All my links are in the description, and you could always unsubscribe if you don't want to watch anymore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.